We'll just be getting started in a minute. Okay, so we will get started now, and I realize there might be two of me. No, we have removed that. So hello and welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Narinder Dhami, New Power Labs founder. I would love to have each of you introduce yourself in the chat. I'm really excited about the conversation today with Ray Williams. And for those of you joining us for the first time, or maybe less familiar with New Power Labs is a think tank and do tank. Our work focuses on moving capital and shifting power to underfunded and overlooked leaders and communities. This work spans across the diversity of Canada, across gender diversity, ethnicity, ability, sexual orientation, citizenship status, language, class, and more. We work in partnership with those who deploy capital, from philanthropy to impact investing to venture capital into traditional finance, or really across the capital spectrum. And we do this work with a growing group of core partners we are incredibly grateful for. These include the World Education Services, WES, Coast Capital, Toronto, Ontario Trillium Foundation, CFC, InSpirit Foundation, Duca Impact Lab, Vancouver Foundation, Jumpstart, Dragonfly Ventures, and McConnell Foundation, plus a network of an additional 20 asset owners and asset managers at foreign New Power Labs. I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I've spent most of my life and continue to live and work and play in Toronto, now known as Toronto. Today, Toronto is covered under Treaty 13, the Williams Treaty. It is the traditional territories of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Nashobe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. As an organization focused on capital flows toward underfunded communities, New Power Lab commits to partnering and supporting Indigenous communities in our research practices and partnerships. We know that there continues to be a disproportionate impact to Indigenous participation in Canada's economy as a result of our history, and there is so much more to do to close this gap. So a few quick elements of housekeeping. The session will be recorded. After the session, we will post a recap on our website along with a recording. If you have any questions for us, please submit your questions in the Q&A box as we go along. We will try to integrate them as best as we can in what I hope and I know will be a very dynamic conversation with Ray. You can also vote for a question. So as we're speaking, feel free to do that as well. And today's session is a bit of a pre-session toward a gathering we are having in 2.5 weeks, the Capital Unlock Summit. And this will happen on November 12th and 13th in downtown Toronto. A big thanks to our sponsors at World Education Services, Clear Skies Investment Management, Genesis Capital Management, the Lawson Foundation, and RIA Ventures for helping us make this event possible. A whole set of really compelling speakers from across North America, including Morgan Simon, Vu Lee, the Honorable Ratna Amdamar, Dr. Carolyn Hussein, Dr. Tawari, Bruce McDonald, Smith Adaz, and much more. And the conversation is about charting the future of capital. So we do hope you can join us in a few weeks in person. Now, for the conversation today, it's my deep pleasure to introduce Ray Williams, who probably doesn't need an introduction, but I will provide a short one just in case. So Ray is a co-founder and chair of the Black Opportunity Fund, and I also have the pleasure to sit with him on the board of Black Opportunity Fund Capital. Ray's career has been marked by exceptional senior leadership in the financial sector, including formerly the vice chairman of financial markets at National Bank, and as well as a deep community leader dedicated to creating opportunities for underfunded and underserved communities across Canada, multiple boards, multiple advisories, really somebody who has embodied what it means to be Canadian. So thank you, Ray, for joining us, and let's get into it. We hope you all are engaged and ask questions along the way. And today's conversation is around where we're at. So Canada is at a crossroads. On one hand, overlooked leaders and communities are building solutions that strengthen industries and local economies. On the other hand, they continue to face entrenched barriers to capital at a moment where principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion are facing growing backlash. Sometimes we think it's only happening in the US, but for many of us closer to the space, we know and we see this in Canada. Capital deployers face a choice: stepping back in response to the growing resistance or doubling down in unlocking capital and talent to drive resilience and growth, which could not come at a more important time for Canada as we think about our economic future. So Ray, how do you see this moment? From your depth of experience of advancing capital to Black communities for decades, what opportunities and threats does this moment bring?
Yeah, so good afternoon to all. And where do I start with such a big question? The reality is that where we sit right now may actually represent another moment of potential positive change. Why do I say that? I think quite often when we find ourselves getting the type of pushback that we've seen, it may actually represent the potential and possibility of change. So over the last 5 years, we've seen a lot of support based on everything coming out of the George Floyd situation. In the meantime, and in the background, you've always had those who have either quietly pushed back or actively undertaken to um, undo what was being done. The reality is that capital has been lacking for underserved communities, First Nations, Black communities, any number of communities out there. And in our prior conversation, I think I mentioned the fact that, look, the resources that we have ends up being our people, our greatest asset. And so that reality is, if you have that asset, why would you have it be that you're not utilizing it, that you're not optimizing it? We know in Canada that small and medium-sized businesses are the drivers of the economy. And so if you have the opportunity to utilize those assets, fund those assets to help that particular piece, why wouldn't you? It would make sense to me. So notwithstanding where we are, the challenges, notwithstanding where we are, the pushback, I'm still very much of the opinion that you get your head into the wind and push ahead. And I do believe that there's this sort of paradox, if you will, of progress. And I'm going to take that as a more positive aspect around signal of change that might be occurring, that's actually happening. And I think if you were to look back in history, you've seen that, in any number of contexts, whether it be rights for the LGBTQ community, civil rights, women's suffrage, just a whole bunch of things where, the resistance, sorry, you face intense resistance at points in those particular journeys, but that also reflected that maybe ground was being gained. And so I choose to embrace that. The fact that we've had so much of this become more open, more apparent to people who may not have seen that, I think is good. And I think I also noted just recently Concordia doing something that really encouraged me, which was the investment they made. I think it was with
Realize.
Realize.
Yeah.
Yes, I keep thinking Rally, but it's Realize.
Yeah.
Um, and to me, that's just a great and encouraging signal because in the midst of this backlash, we have organizations that are very clear about their intent and the possibilities that exist for the Canadian economy. Forget about just underserved communities, because I think there is a larger conversation to be had that, you're doing all of this, but if it benefits those communities, it has the opportunity to engage the whole of Canada and benefit the whole of Canada. That's certainly my takeaway.
Yeah, and on that last point, it's a core part of how we think in New Power Labs as well, of, the economic potential if we can tap into the talents of all Canadians. It doesn't seem like that is a headline in the conversation of productivity and economic opportunity in the broader national conversation today. When it
Mhm.
comes to, we're talking big infrastructure, we're talking about different ways and pathways for economic growth. Do you have a sense of why it's not as prominent as it could be in terms of a lever of growth that is pulled on by leadership at the government or at other kind of other folks around the country?
I would state that there is a degree of short-sightedness that has been fairly consistent. If I was to look back at more recent, the previous government under Justin Trudeau's leadership, while some funds did flow to Black communities, the reality is it was like I just felt that they were sprinkling, you know, bits of, oh, here you go. But there was nothing that was really definitive about how can we change and actually help spur real growth. I don't think there was sufficient thought given to it in many respects. And interestingly enough, with this new government, the focus is actually on how do we get productivity back to where it needs to be? How do we undertake projects that would represent encouraging that productivity and having multiply effects within the economy? And yet, in large part, I think those underserved communities are once again overlooked, right? I saw an announcement last week. I think it was Small Businesses Week. Oh, there's 189 million over 5 years to small businesses and Black communities.
Yeah.
And I look at that, the headline looks okay. Oh, 189 million. And you're like, oh, okay, 189 million over 5 years. And you're looking to do exactly what with that? What are the expectations around that?
Yeah.
So it begs the question around how serious or what thought has been given to this. Another piece that really just actually points to what I'm speaking to, I saw recently all the folks from across the country that had been included to reflect and represent and provide input into the AI strategy for the AI minister. And I just shook my head in dismay because there was no one that represented, color or diversity from
Mm,
underserved communities. Were there women? Absolutely. Were there any number of other folks? A lot of white folks. And
yeah.
hey, you know what? Maybe they're the smartest, but I know a ton of people from community who are experts in AI and are regularly, sought out to expound and share their knowledge. And yet, so unfortunately, this is a almost a mindset of overlooking the bloody obvious, right? And it drives
Yeah.
me nuts, but you have to just continue pushing to have that recognition and understanding that irrespective of the amount of fatigue around diversity, we are increasingly a diverse society. And again, I point to the notion that if you're not utilizing the resources that you have, then you're essentially wasting them. You're not optimizing them, and that does not actually lead to beneficial outcomes for the larger Canadian community.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And then in your work in particular with the Black Opportunity Fund, what are some of the biggest misconceptions you've encountered about investing or funding Black leaders?
Well, again, my takeaway would be that the focus is only on these players that are terribly small players that are focused in the food industry or in the hair industry. Yes, they may be a bit of overrepresentation in that sphere, but there are any number of players, some small, some medium-sized, and some large, that come from community that are happen to be in construction, that happen to be in pharma, that happens to be in a lot of industries. And again, the major challenge ends up consistently being that those folks are overlooked, just quite simply. And so you have to keep pushing the narrative around we are engaged in a wide variety of spaces and industries. I mean, for God's sakes, if you see us working in finance, in pharma, in AI, in all aspects of IT, why in heaven's name wouldn't you believe that there are individuals who are entrepreneurs from said communities that also have a desire to build businesses within those industries? It beggars the imagination in large part. And so, like I said, we have to keep pushing to change the narrative so that there's greater understanding that, Black communities are not monolithic in the way that no other communities are monolithic, and that, there's a huge amount that needs to be undertaken and understood here. And so I take it upon myself with those that surround me at Black Opportunity Fund to push in every direction, to engage with people from a variety of spaces that one might not ordinarily see as natural uh, natural partners, because I think you have to push in every single space.
In the last few years, what do you think has been most successful in moving from, I would say 5 years ago, there was even quite a bit more of a singular version of an underrepresented entrepreneur, what they did, what they look like, what they, their ability to succeed. And in the last 5 years, while we've made some growth and some change, we're not far enough. But in that last 5 years, what really stands out as something that's helped to shift the narrative of an underfunded leader?
So there's probably a number of different places we can go with this. One of the obvious ones is that there are a number of different organizations, including yours, that has continued to highlight the opportunities and the possibilities. So there's that. There's organizations like Black Founders Network out of Rockman Stroke U of T that has helped also push young entrepreneurs. I've seen a number of different organizations pop up. I think there's one with Claudette McGowan, and which is a specific focus on female entrepreneurs
Yeah.
in that regard, where social impact is important, but economic impact even more
Yeah.
so. And I think organizations of that nature, I'd also like to say, obviously, Black Opportunity Fund, as we engage in conversation and share what we believe to be the underlying philosophy about how we're undertaking what we're undertaking. And ultimately, I think it's we have to just keep doing and show the capability and show results rather than this is a feel good, oh, you should do that because it's equitable. No, you should do it because it makes bloody good sense. It makes economic sense and it has social impact. So, you get in wins all around. And as I've stated before, if we can do this correctly, it represents a big leg up and win for Canada, not just for those underserved communities.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things I feel in particular last 5 years, there's been a significant amount of performance, which has led to a lot of the feeling and sentiment that this pendulum has shifted so far, and that folks no longer who need access to capital no longer need access to capital or supports, or when we're trying to figure out how we create access to opportunity with that performance, which I think sometimes touches a bit more on the emotional side, on the kind of this is just it's a good thing to do versus it's the right thing to do for our economy. So when you think about this moment where we've been through 5 years, again, some things have been fairly performative, some have been very substantive as well. But we're in this moment of backlash, we're in a moment of fatigue. What does leadership look like in this moment? For when you think of the importance of this work, but also the pressures against the work.
Yeah. You know, um, it's tough, and no doubt you have a full understanding of that. The toughness is 5 years ago when the spotlight shone on everything that was taking place, and there was a greater desire to understand. There was probably more ability to embrace what was the obvious.
Yeah.
5 years later, to your point, we're in a moment of backlash. Uh, I understand the fatigue around diversity. I've seen it before as it spoke to employment equity. Most people might not even understand that I've actually been in what they now call diversity, this space in the background for the last 25 years, having pushed aspects of this with the federal government back as early as 2000 as part of the Embracing Change initiative with the federal government. Uh, the reality is that at this point in time, we need even greater clarity of purpose around how we speak to what it is that we're doing. We need to really try and create distinction about why it is that we're doing what it is that we're doing. It's not about, oh, diversity is good. It's more about, here is what you're missing by not embracing and supporting. Here's who's harmed by the status quo at a time when we're talking about, our lack of productivity, where we are in the OECD, and where we as a nation, in terms of our wealth, might be heading, right? Um, you have to take, you have to be bolder than ever. Um, and like I said, you have to point to that whole piece that says, look at the resources that we have. Look at the talent that's available. Look at the brilliance that's available. Why are we not utilizing that? Why are we not funding that? Right? And
Yeah.
so we need to see more of that. That's kind of where I'm coming from. I do believe you have to own what is I would say, the complexity of the situation. I mean, this is not simple work by any means, right? So you have to own the complexity. Um, you have to actually get and coax out of those who want to support you the notion that while commitments were made that haven't been kept, maybe couldn't have been kept, um, you know, have that dialogue about the lack of throughput as it speaks to impact. Otherwise, so much of it ends up looking performative. And I hate to say, a lot of it has been performative. I don't necessarily want to point fingers specifically at companies, but I will say that I've seen programs in the last while, and this is stuff that was in the Globe and Mail. Um, Big law firm, fantastically successful program,
Yeah.
a Bay Street law firm, bringing in folks from First Nations community, Black communities, underserved communities. And they essentially said, well, we're going to put the program in hold,
Yeah.
notwithstanding how successful it is, because we want to review it. And I think you just have to look at the reality. Is like, we are an international law firm. We also operate in the US. The woke ideology that they are pushing against in the US will cross the border. That's just a reality.
Yeah.
And so they're mining their P's and Q's from that perspective because they want to do business down there. And as we've seen with some clarity, um, the way that DEI initiatives have been weaponized and conflated, it means that for those who never liked it or didn't believe it was necessary, it's an easy thing to embrace and push back on, right? This is where we are. This is where we are. So when I talk about we need even bolder leadership and we have to put our head down straight into the wind, that's what we have to do. But we also have to build coalitions. We have to engage all of those that see the reality and understand that this is not something we can achieve overnight. I mean, we're talking about structural changes within organizations. And I always make the statement, if you do not see or hear from senior management or the leaders of organization speaking about this thing, then I think you have to have a takeaway that says they will pay lip service to it, but it's not as important to them. And my takeaway would be that you can actually have both. You can undertake that and still speak to the bottom line if you undertake that structural leadership or that structural change in a manner that can be embraced by your organization from a cultural standpoint.
So touching on that silence at the top piece,
Yeah.
and given given our connection to the a lot of firms' connections to the U.S., and I'm familiar with a law firm you mentioned, and what what's happening there as well. But if you look at our banks, you look at some of our consumer companies, like there is more and more silence at the top of Canadian companies. So we're not we're not saying we're not going to do it, but we are stopping to say we are going to do it.
Right.
And so there's, a group of folks that believe in this moment, um, the best thing to do is go under the radar, continue the work, but go under the radar. And then others that feel that once you go under the radar, it's going to be very hard to get the work done. Curious what your thoughts are in this moment of more and more organizations in Canada. I would say perhaps taking a more shadow approach. So not
Mhm.
publicly making statements that they're removing programming or support, but quietly, that kind of quiet pullback. Um, can that happen and can the work continue?
So I think it's actually important to both take place, would you believe?
Yeah,
Um, the reality is that quite often speaking truth is costly. I mean,
yeah,
I know this at a personal level. I worked in banking, and my
yeah,
big mouth got me into trouble on more than one occasion with senior people. It didn't take away from my truth. But by the
yeah,
same token, I have been uh, a quiet social impact warrior in Bay Street for over 3 decades. So you can have both and create outcomes that will change so much fundamentally. I'll give you an example. I look back to, there's an organization out there in Bay Street now called CAUFP, the Canadian Association of Financial Professionals. I'm
yeah,
proudly a member and proudly one of the founding presidents back in 1997. So the organization's been there almost 28 years now and doing well. It was never something that was pushed into anyone's face, but we worked very quietly in the background to bring and create coalitions and get support from the major players, the big banks, along the way. And that was done slowly. And now when I look at the organization and I look at its memberships, I'm like, moving in the right direction for sure. But it's also then allowed that organization to become normalized with all the financial services players who now support it financially.
yeah.
And that in itself has also then created greater access and opportunity into those organizations. So there is something to be said about working quietly in the background and showing those results and actually changing the environment that you work in and changing people's perception as well. So for me, that's important. But I think it would also be nice to see more leaders speaking out with some clarity. Now, there's one bank in particular, the Green Bank, that has been fairly consistent over the years. And, you
Yeah.
know, that consistency has shown itself irrespective. So they just simply continue to do what they've always done. And I think the the um, the employees, the partners, and various stakeholders see and acknowledge this. And that's been a consistent pattern of behavior. And they have very, very large footprints in the US, especially along the Eastern Seaboard, right?
Yeah.
So I think there are, there is not one single way to achieve what one might want to achieve in this regard. I think you have to look at multiple approaches because one approach it will not work in every single instance. But there is commonality within the approaches that hopefully one can take and make more consistent throughout.
And as we think about different types of capital, do you find that there is a difference in how philanthropic dollars to underfunded leaders is moving in that trajectory versus investment dollars to underfunded communities? And you wear both hats with Black Opportunity Fund and Black Opportunity Fund Capital and a lot of other work that you do in the community. So curious if you're seeing a different trajectory for those two movements that have a lot of parallels, but also are very different types of capital. And just a quick reminder, if you do have any questions, please add them to the Q&A. I'll be heading there in a minute.
Yeah, so my takeaway is that there are consistent players in both spaces. Those consistent players end up wanting to create social impact. But the reason why BOF is different is that we have looked at what endowment represents. It has not worked for Black communities. And so we have to do something different, quite simply. And that's why we have BOF Capital. So we intend to undertake the mandate in a way that will represent change over time. This is not, a 5-year or even a 10-year project. This is something that certainly within my lifetime will not be achieved from where I sit, but hopefully my engagement and those around me will solidify the foundation. So going back to your question, yes, there are commonalities. Those commonalities reflect and represent what I deem to be social focused capital. But in other instances, you will have some of that with the desire for, if not market returns, then close to market returns. Because quite often within the space, what you will have is an understanding that if it's patient capital, if it's social impact capital, that a return less than market is still something that is permissible, that will be embraced because you are actually achieving over and above in so much that you are creating a change from a social impact perspective that you would like to through the work of the economic impact, right? And those two things, as we know, are inextricably linked. And so, you try and work with both of them.
And so as we think about then how do we measure progress, whether we're measuring it on the, philanthropic dollar capital to underfunded leaders or investment capital to underfunded leaders, there seems to be a gap, which I know we know all too well at New Power Labs, a gap in collecting that information, a gap in the research to fund that information, the collection of that information. And it is also very deeply tied into be able to make the economic argument for why it's important to think about all the talent of all Canadians versus some Canadians and how we think about capital flow. What are your thoughts on that? Like when we think about like to make the economic argument, we need data.
Yep.
Do we, and we have enough, we're researched out on, the opportunity of, having women on boards or diverse people on boards, diverse leaders. Like we're researched out on at an academic level of knowing that that is good. But sometimes what we lack is the actual facts on the ground in Canada of how many
Yep.
businesses have, been created by X communities, what the economic growth is. And how do we solve that?
Well, it's, as you quite correctly pointed out, from a historical standpoint, the data, whatever data there is, has been aggregated.
Yeah.
So we do need that disaggregated data, first of all, and we'll still need a bit of a timeline to have that disaggregated data in a way that allows us to establish, here's what actually took place, here are
Yeah.
the impacts, etc. I mean, look, at the end of the day, we need to focus on outcomes. Um, you know, process metrics are great, like because we do wraparound support. So it's important for us to sort of have that still, but we need impact metrics, all right? We need those KPIs. We need to co-create, whether it be on the purely charitable side, where with our funders, we sit down and have a conversation about how those dollars are going to be used, number one, what it will look like if we're successful, number two, and establish together what those metrics, those measurements look like, what the impact metrics look like. So I think that's super important. It's probably easier on the other side where the investment is about returns. You can break that down a little bit easier, but because it has the social component to it, it still becomes somewhat tricky. But again, we have the opportunity to do that. The unfortunate thing is that we've not had the necessary information to show unequivocally here's how change is occurring, simply because that data, as I pointed out, has been aggregated in the past. Now, I think you and I may have been in the same room in Ottawa a couple of years ago when
Yeah.
the chief
Yeah.
statistician for Canada
Yeah.
committed to disaggregating data as it speaks to Black communities and underserved communities in general. So I think that will be helpful as we move ahead. But, notwithstanding the fact that it's not there, I still think there are ways to establish KPIs on pretty much everything that you undertake, if you have clarity from the outset. And I think if you don't, you actually, in some respects, are setting up organizations for failure. Why do I say that? Well, quite simply, if you are receiving funding and you spend it without having a clear sense of what outcomes you want to see from the limited funding that you have an issue overall, right? So
Yeah.
we need to change that. And I don't believe that some of what I've seen over the last 4 or 5 years, despite government feeling that it is helping, has actually helped, because I don't believe that there have been sufficient metrics associated with this sprinkling and filigree of, funding.
Yeah, that's a good point. And do you think when you think about this opportunity of data, I don't know if we're putting enough attention or pressure perhaps on StatsCan right now. I know there was that great conversation in Ottawa,
Mhm.
but I personally have not seen as much of the output in a disaggregated form that would enable us to have more of that evidence base of why this makes sense.
Yeah. Um, I'm just trying to remember. I did see something that reflected maybe some of that disaggregation. I'm just trying to remember what it
Yeah.
was now. And off the top of my head, I cannot remember. I think to your point, I think we probably need to put a question to Stats Canada about how far have they managed to get in this particular process, and what outputs they've been able to realize during that space of time over the last 2 years, I think.
Yeah, you've added another task to our list. Um, and so how do you grade us? How do you grade Canada? The last 5 years, we talked a little bit about some performance elements. We've talked about, there's just generally been much more awareness achieved in the last 5 years. This view of we've gone over our pendulum has shifted so far. And then you have all these organizations that did not exist 5 years ago that are doing tremendous work across communities. So if you had to give Canada a grade of figuring out capital to underfunded leaders in the last 5 years, what would you grade?
Probably C at best.
Okay, and why?
Well, it simply hasn't happened, has it?
Yeah,
I mean, the bottom line is, and I might add that my thinking is probably somewhat influenced more so by what has been lacking from government.
yeah,
Okay, because I do believe government has a leadership role to play in this space, because that leadership role, I think, then has a lot of impact for those from your coalition, for instance, who are looking to do similar. And
yeah.
so I don't think they've been as forthcoming, certainly with Black communities. That's what I'll speak from, as they should have been. And I think, once again, even with this new government, we're missing the opportunity, even as they talk about that desire to increase productivity, that desire to change, everything to do with investment here in Canada. Sometimes it's the small components that actually ends up triggering so much more. And so it's great that you got the major projects office, like multi-billion-dollar projects, fantastic. But, how about igniting some of the bushfire at much lower levels, to get this system moving and running? So that's where I'm coming from in that regard. As I mentioned earlier on in this conversation, when you see organizations like Concordia undertaking what it did recently, I doff my cap, and I know for a fact there are many other organizations out there outside of government. So they're probably going to get from me certainly a higher rating because there's a greater focus and emphasis on undertaking that funding.
Yeah, yeah. It makes me think of a few things of how we think about the path forward around um, pushing two narratives that the government currently hasn't embraced. So one is the economic potential of underfunded leaders, that talent, again, not on the headlines. The other, which is different, but the care economy is also not a core focus of it. And I think there are a lot of underrepresented leaders in the care economy doing some tremendous work. And so I do think there's an opportunity, while I think the government is doing some really great moves to further build out the economic picture of what Canada looks like. We do have a few questions I want to turn to. The first is around a question around the economic downturn. So generally during economic downturns, there's a growing narrative that use diverse communities, especially immigrants, and we're seeing a deep anti-immigrant sentiment across Canada right now, as scapegoats. Funding to diverse communities are the first to go as budget tightens. How do we counter that? And I'll just add, I think at a philanthropic level, funding to newcomers and migrants and immigrants has always been limited. And
Yeah.
even at an investment level, I've not seen it as a core focus where it is such a high opportunity. So curious for you, in this moment of anti-immigrant backlash, um, how do we counter this as we think about the path forward to capital?
Yeah, well, it's unfortunate because we're always going to have threats in these situations, whether it be how momentum is lost based on the backlash. You know, we've seen talent drain, funding cuts, and the like. The reality is, again, that we're left in a situation where we continue to strive to find the appropriate partnerships, collaborations that will help uh, push back, if you will, against that. And it's tough because it's very easy to find targets with immigrant communities and immigrants as, the place not to undertake anything. It's an easy and cheap narrative, and we've seen it played out so many times and so often. And yet there is, for those who want to be honest, there's an understanding that without our immigrant communities, and for God's sakes, we're a country of immigrants, without our immigrant communities, we really have, a massive hole in the economy, right?
Yeah.
So let's understand that, number one, and number two, let's embrace what it is that Canada is meant to represent. And again, this is where leadership comes in. But I think it's much easier at the government level based on who's in power to take cheap shots from that perspective. And then it's very, very easy for those who are looking to point the finger at someone to undertake that. So it's not surprising. Look, we've seen this before. I've seen this um, during economic downturns in terms of cycles where diversity or equity work, as it was better known back then, it's like, yeah, we really like this, but you know what? We've been asked to make cuts. So this is where the first cut is going to come. And quite often, I think it's like, you know, you're looking in the wrong place potentially, right?
Yeah, yeah. But the worry is real in this moment of economic downturn for Canada. And as we think about what is going to be cut. So another a question around Black Opportunity Fund. Yeah.
Mhm.
So when the Black Opportunity Fund decides who to invest in, how does it balance the need to make good financial decisions and to keep the fund healthy, and with its mission to fight anti-Black racism and make a positive difference in the community? And I wonder if this is maybe touch both on Black Opportunity Fund's approach and then Black Opportunity Fund Capital's approach.
Well,
Yeah,
so what I'll say is as
yeah,
follows. Let's speak to Black Opportunity Fund first.
yeah.
And How we devised that was because we recognize that funding for Black communities was simply not coming through. We got the scraps from the table if we were lucky. And so it sort of established very clearly for us this is not working. We need something new and something different. That new and different was the idea of setting up an arm's length organization that was focused on investment. But that investment was going to be into Black entrepreneurs, Black businesses, and the like. Well, look, Black Opportunity Fund Capital is no different from any other investment manager, if you will. It's just that our mandate is maybe one that represents a double bottom line, maybe a triple bottom line. So we're looking for returns because without those returns, we don't have the opportunity to take that extra funding that we'll get through those returns and reinvest with not only entrepreneurs, but into social impact for charitable organizations and not for profits within Black communities. So that's an essential part of the thinking. In terms of where and who we invest with, well, look, we have an investment thesis that we're comfortable with, and we have a professional and professionals driving the organization. So this is not something that's been done off the side of someone's desk. This is something that has been well thought out, that is being implemented in an appropriate way, with a very specific focus on here are the returns that we're looking for, and here is also the social impact we're looking to make by entertaining those returns. And again, it's driven very, very clearly by an investment thesis that we are comfortable with and our partners are comfortable with.
Great. And next question is around backlash of EDI. So a lot of the backlash is also related to this perception of zero-sum game. Well, we could see it as a way to unlock potential and actually grow the pie. Do you see any ears open to that rationale?
So the bottom line is that we've always stated that we don't talk about a pie because a pie, represents immediately this notion of it
Yeah.
is limited rather than the notion that this could be additive.
Yeah.
And the notion of additive just simply speaks to we're not talking zero-sum games here. We're talking about opportunities that will actually lift all boats. I go back to my earlier statement that if we're able to unlock this opportunity in a meaningful fashion, it will drive productivity for Canada. It will drive Canada's GDP. And if that's the case, it represents, a greater wallet for all, right? That
Yeah.
that's a really very straightforward sort of, perspective on that situation. I mean, like I said, it's easy enough to focus on the whole, like let's look at the pie. I get some, that means somebody else is not getting some. I do not believe that necessarily has to be the case.
Yeah. Okay. And when we have two more questions and then I'll ask you one to close it out. But there's another one around bold statements to counter the backlash.
Hmm.
Uh, how do we do that in a way that signals real commitment to impact? Do you think about the moment for funders and organizations to step up? What would this type of bold statement look like that is not performative?
Oh. So I go back to the notion of the paradox,
Yeah.
the paradox of where we are in this continuum as it speaks to progress.
Yeah.
And I would look to formulate a statement around that. I would look to
Yeah.
formulate something that speaks to the fact that there's an acknowledgement that there is fatigue. There's an acknowledgement that not everything has worked in the way that one might have anticipated, but we continue to believe that if we do not utilize the resources that are readily available, we're not optimizing the opportunity for all Canadians. And so that's kind of, at least that
Yeah,
would be my approach to things. If you were talking about how do we construct a statement or narrative to deal with that, right?
yeah,
I think we have to be in the midst of it and looking at it from a particular perspective. And I tend to be pragmatic, but I tend to be probably more an optimist.
yeah,
And that optimism is driven by engagement and recognizing that in large part, most people are willing to help if they're able to, number one, and most people want to see change for the better.
yeah. And I would say in this moment, there's also an opportunity to define the future of Canada. I think if we want to set ourselves up as different than our neighbors or different, a different type of economic future, the ability to invest in all Canadians feels like a compelling moment, tied with, I think, a unique opportunity to recommit um, post the last 5 years with the backlash coming in of there is this, I think, an interesting thing here for funders and leaders to consider. Okay, there are some more questions coming and we are getting out of time. So I'm going to quickly try to ask one or two more. But there is a question around what you think about funding to underrepresented people versus funding for companies that invest in products and services that serve underfunded communities.
Okay, could you please repeat that?
Yeah. So what are your thoughts around, funding to underrepresented leaders
Mhm.
versus funding to perhaps on not underrepresented leaders, but folks that are creating products and services that support the underrepresented individuals and communities?
Well, I would say that I support both, but I would go to the former simply because I want to see more representation in the entrepreneur class and the small business class that represents those from my communities. Yeah, I think we can achieve both aspects with the former, i.e., there are Black entrepreneurs providing, services that are directed to underserved communities, but absolutely no objection to the idea that if in fact those services are lacking and someone is able to provide, culturally specific services, for instance, or products, as the case may be, then I'm very supportive of that as well.
And maybe a final question, a final audience question, and then I do have one to close us out. Is even if we're able to show in hard numbers the value, the economic value that Black communities have contributed to Canada, um, who will pay attention, and how do you still shift a narrative to increase the positive tension and support and recognition of Black communities? I synthesized that one, so hopefully, Sabrina, I got it partially there. But even if we had the data, how do we get people to pay attention to the moment and to the opportunity?
Well, look, the press is really rather good at selling, stories with a huge amount of negativity. There's also an opportunity there to get them to undertake pieces that represents the feel-good, positive vibe of what success might look like as it speaks to impact. But that's just happens to be one particular route. I think there are other routes that you can take. There are any number of industry organizations right across Canada that represents Canadians from all manner of industries. And I don't think it's especially difficult to engage with some of those and have, some of the work that's been undertaken where we are seeing success be shared. And at the end of the day, you also push hard to government to show them what is taking place and use them also for the purposes of sharing that upbeat message.
Amazing. A few takeaways from today's conversation. You mentioned this moment is a huge opportunity for change. It's going to help us weed out the performative approaches, shift the narrative of investing to diverse communities, to something that is more critical and crucial to Canadian economic growth. You mentioned that diverse leaders and entrepreneurs are working and building businesses across various industries. So, how do we move across that singular narrative? How do we make that argument that investing in underfunded leaders and communities is the thing to do in this moment and for economic growth? And how do we get the data that enables and supports it all in a backdrop of quite a critical moment in Canada's trajectory, but also in the trajectory of the way we think about who we are and what it means to be Canadian. Ray, any final thoughts, reflections on the future of capital?
Yeah, we've got a lot of work to do. But like I said, I continue to be encouraged, irrespective of the fact that we are right now in, a Melissa-like storm.
Yeah.
The bottom line is when I see things, as I mentioned, as the Concordia announcement last week, I remain encouraged. And in fact, I'm not in a position to be discouraged because I have to undertake and provide some degree of leadership with the support of those around me to get to where it is that we believe we should be.
Amazing. Thank you, Ray. Really appreciate, like I always do, our conversations. Thank you all for joining us. We would love to see you at our summit on November 12th and 13th. More conversations on the future of capital and hopefully some bold and exciting new opportunities of how we can work together. There is a little feedback survey, so please do fill that out. But deep thanks, Ray. Lovely to see you virtually today and everyone who joined us. Thank you for making the time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay, we'll leave. So if anyone wants to fill out the feedback, please do. We'll leave this open for a moment. Thanks for joining, everybody.